I'm delighted to introduce this panel to talk about how we can use big data to combat illegal networks and illegal organizations. And let me just preface it before I introduce the panel by saying I go back to the old days, 1980s, when I actually did prosecute the original mafia, the guys with the bent noses and that you see movies about. And we used data in those days, but we did it manually. And that took a long time. It took us years to do. So I'm delighted to see how quickly things have moved. In order to talk about the way in which, in real life, big data has been useful, we have three terrific participants here who have real practical experience. First, Francisco Niembro, who is the Undersecretary for IT at the Ministry of Public Security in Mexico. Second, Mike Leiter, who I was proud to call a colleague and still am proud to call a friend over the last several years, former director of the National Counterterrorism Center. And finally, Javier Osorio, University of Notre Dame PhD candidate in political science. Now, we all know that there's been an explosion in the amount of information that has been collected and can be collected, not only the traditional way we collect intelligence and information, but also using social media, geolocation, metadata, and all different kinds of information. The question is, how do we use it, and how can we be effective about it? How can we be interoperable across the different kinds of data, structured and unstructured? And how do we make it analytically useful and accessible so people can take action? Let me begin by turning to Mike Leiter and saying, Mike, you were involved in operating the National Counterterrorism Center. Can you give us 3 or 4 minutes of just how that worked in terms of dealing with large amounts of data?
Sure. In my years at NCTC, the National Counterterrorism Center really went through 3 phases of dealing with data. The first was immediately after 9/11, the creation of the center. The President directed NCTC must have all information, and no one really knew what that meant at the time. But what it developed into was that as many networks as possible from the US government, the CIA, FBI, Department of Homeland Security, fed into one building. And data integration at that time meant that an analyst would look at one network, then he'd push a button, look at the next network, push a button, look at the next network, and write all of this down on paper and eventually lead to some integration in his head. The second stage, which we reached probably about 4 or 5 years ago, was a slight improvement of that, which was being able to type in a single search and hit all of those networks and get basic results back, but still not being able to really integrate that data in a meaningful way, simply easing the collection, I should say, the retrieval of that information from a variety of databases. And the third stage, which I think we kind of entered in the last 2 to 3 years, was an ability to, regardless of where that data lay, to be able to search for that data, then visualize the results of that data, enhance the data that was retrieved, and then share that amongst different analysts within NCTC and within the US government, regardless of what was, I shouldn't say regardless, but even within an incredibly complicated web of legal and security limitations about who could see what types of data.
Now, Francisco, you've been on the front line of dealing with organized crime and drug cartels in Mexico, and there's been an initiative in recent years in particular to use data in order to be strategic in attacking these criminal networks and organizations. Can you give us some insight about your experience?
Sí, por supuesto. Gracias. Thank you, Mr. Chertoff. Thank you, Google people, for the invitation. En México, y déjenme ir un poco a la historia rápidamente, hace 5 años y medio, el gobierno mexicano, el señor presidente Felipe Calderón, decide hacer una estrategia para combatir al crimen organizado y la delincuencia común. Esto implicó una estrategia que contenía 7 ejes, y uno de los más importantes es el eje de la tecnología, que implicó en el caso de México desarrollar en un tiempo de 5 años una plataforma tecnológica que conocemos en México como Plataforma México y que contiene una red nacional encriptada que utiliza paquetes para podernos comunicar con todas las agencias de seguridad y procuración de justicia. A su vez, esta red nos da acceso a una base de datos con todos los datos criminales que poseemos hoy en día en México, lo cual es una gran ventaja porque el tener una sola base de datos que todos alimentemos y todos podamos consultar, realmente sería el sueño de muchos de los países que hoy en día operan la parte de inteligencia. Esto implicó, desde luego, desarrollar software especializado, entre otros sistemas de correlación, como los que hemos visto, que hacen grandes redes de relación entre personas, vehículos, armas, eventos, que pueden alcanzar 14 grados de relación y hasta 25,000 puntos de correlación en un solo mapa. Desde luego que analizar esto implica tener personal con un nivel de preparación muy diferente al que teníamos en el pasado. Les comento que la Policía Federal pasó de 6,000 elementos cuando empezamos hace 5 años y medio, y hoy tenemos 36,000 elementos en la Policía Federal y 8,500 de ellos están completamente dedicados a la parte de inteligencia, siguiendo el modelo internacional de inteligencia que implica desde la planeación, la captación de datos, el análisis, por supuesto, y la explotación de los mismos. Hoy en día México está en condiciones de trabajar hacia el futuro y poder contrarrestar en buena medida con trabajo de inteligencia toda esta problemática de inseguridad que viene desde los cárteles de las drogas hasta delincuencia común que hoy en día se combina para pues generar problemas a la sociedad mexicana.
Javier, you've heard the experience of Mike Leiter and the experience of Francisco. What's your perspective on the practical significance of this?
Yeah, I think there has been a fantastic revolution on the availability of data and the quality of it. We saw with Jason that now you can go back in time for several years to get very detailed data. At the same time, you can get real-time data on many different kinds of things. But now the answer is not only on the quantity and quality of data that we have as citizens and analysts and researchers, but the key there is to ask the right questions to that kind of data. The answer is not only having more data, but asking the right questions. And you can use that as a very powerful tool to empower citizens and analysts and scholars to help the governments to do better. And what we mean to do better is not only to be more effective in terms of disrupting these illegal networks, but also to do that by defending human rights, protecting civil rights, and acting within the law. So there are like some tensions here, having like all this data availability, trying to open up governments, and sometimes governments try to close that information due to national security concerns, right? At the same time, we want, because of these national security concerns, governments to keep a close eye on terrorists. But what if that implies the government taking a look at your email account and tapping on your cell phone calls? Like all those different things generate tensions from the government with civil society and criminals. So there are like many different things that analysts, civil society, NGOs, experts can help governments to improve not only the efficiency, but also the respect of human rights and civil liberties.
Well, it seems to me that you've kind of set it up for two interesting questions that flow from this. Obviously, we've talked about different kinds of data we collect, whether it's criminal histories or travel data or things of that sort. But recall as well, there's a lot of data we collect that involves geolocation of where you are at particular points of time, metadata about your device and how you communicate, video, audio, all kinds of data that move across the globe. So with all this information, how do we construct a system that allows the analyst to really make use? And I think you said, Javier, it's about asking the right questions. So Mike, let me turn to you. As you dealt with an increasing stream of data that came into the US government, how did you build a system that allowed you to manage it in a way that was user-friendly to the analyst and to the decision maker?
It's incredibly difficult for a couple of reasons. And the first thing you have to do is, in my view, make the source of the data and the issues around what type of data it is largely irrelevant to the analytic user. Because if you have an analyst or anyone, oversight person from outside of government, an operator looking at counter-drug work, who has to worry about where the data is from or what the data is, they will spend all their time doing that. What you want them to do is, just as Javier said, you want them to be able to use technology to ask the intuitive questions that any good investigator or thoughtful person would ask, and be able to do that quickly and seamlessly across all of these types of data. Have all of that data then visualized in a common work environment so they can see the connections and draw those connections, and then continue to iterate. And on the point, when I say that where the data is from should be irrelevant to the user, that does not mean that in designing the system, where the data is from or what type of data it is irrelevant. In fact, it absolutely has to be central to the technology, because the same technology that allows you to analyze and iterate using a really powerful piece of technology, your brain, that same technology is what can be used effectively to protect the civil liberties and privacy, to make sure that the especially sensitive video information that is being collected, perhaps you have to be in a small select group to see that, or the phone intercepts that some people would use. Only some would see it, and then they might only be able to see it for 10 days, and then the technology makes sure that that information is deleted from the system. So you want the brain to be able to intuit what questions to ask, and that takes a new kind of training for a new type of data analyst in many cases. But you want even people who aren't data experts to be able to do that, and you build the technology in a way that the same integration it can give you provides you critical civil liberties and privacy protection that the person who's doing the analysis doesn't even have to think about.
So Javier, it strikes me that from what Mike is saying, that the challenge in building the architecture of an analytic system and the algorithms is something that is interoperable enough that you can look at all the different kinds of data and you can have visibility across everything that you have, and yet is designed in a way so that you still have control of the data. So, for example, legal rules about who can see what are still honored. How practical is it to build this kind of architecture that's both open and controlled?
Well, I think that's one of the biggest challenges, not only for government in securing that kind of data, making sure that you implement the appropriate protocol for securing that information, having that completely anonymous so no one gets targeted, because there are like real like ethical liabilities here. But one of the most important things is here to keep in mind that the increasing complexity demands a lot more from the analysts, not only from the analysts in government agencies, but also scholars and policy analysts. And that goes back to my original point of it's always very important to ask the right questions. If we want to know not only the efficacy of specific tactics, that we need a lot of information about those tactics, but we also need to analyze the consequences of those tactics. For example, I don't know if John is here, I cannot see him, but we can ask about, for example, mass incarceration. Is that an effective tool for deterring crime or not? Is it really a social and racial profiling tool for social control? I mean, there are like many other different things that we can ask with this data. Also, for example, the war on drugs. After 60 years of fighting drugs, what are the results? What are the costs of this war in terms of resources, institutions, but also in the so-called collateral damage? Violence, corruption, political risks. So those are like the many things that we now have a lot more of information, and it takes a lot of brain power, institutions, money to support these large amounts of data, and analysts to really understand what is going on and ask the right questions. And then what we do with that, right? It's not only, okay, we have these 60 years of war on drugs with very dubious results. What are the alternatives? What will happen if we put $1 on enforcement versus $1 on development, education, to fight poverty? What will be the outcome of that? How long will it take? What is the appropriate combination of law enforcement and development to focus on this? So we can start to speculate and play with the data in order to draw different scenarios of what will happen and play the counterfactual here. we can also dare to ask, like, what will happen if we legalize? I mean, there's like a very heavy weight on like ideological perspective and political polarization here, but let the data speak. Let's ask the data for the right questions and get enough brain power from different perspectives. And I think Google is a great venue to start doing that, to ask the right questions, like get all that information out of the data and get good answers.
That raises an interesting point. We tend to think about this analytics in a very tactical way. In other words, how do we make a case against a particular network? You're raising the question whether we can also use the data strategically to understand broader trends in all kinds of illicit activity in networks and the social conditions that give rise to them. Francisco, in your experience with Plataforma Mexico, have you found it, obviously it's been useful tactically because of some tremendous successes we've seen, but have you found an interest in using it strategically to look more broadly at trends in illegal behavior and social conditions?
Desde luego que sí. Sin embargo, este es un tema de etapas. En esta primera etapa, Plataforma México, el reto mayor que tenía era tener los datos, la información de todos los participantes, estados, municipios y federación, y cuidar la calidad, cuidar la actualización de la misma y poder ponerla a disposición de las fuerzas del orden a nivel nacional para empezar a tener operación bajo un mismo sistema estandarizado. La segunda cara de manejar esta información seguramente nos va a dar datos, como menciona Javier, donde podemos ver tendencias, podemos ver el impacto social que está teniendo las acciones policiales, por ejemplo, en el caso de México, e ir haciendo las correcciones. Pero primero tienes que dar el paso 1, luego el 2 y luego el 3. No puedes dar los 3 pasos al mismo tiempo porque uno u otro entorpecerían a los previos. El hecho es que México dejó de invertir en sus policías durante 30 años. Entonces tenemos muy poco tiempo para reconstruir la institución de seguridad pública, que es lo que estamos haciendo en la Policía Federal, para posteriormente lograr que los estados suban a este mismo concepto, manejen los mismos procedimientos y seamos un cuerpo único policial a nivel de Estado mexicano. Y desde luego en los laterales tenemos que ir cuidando los aspectos, pues como se dicen, colaterales hacia la sociedad y todo el entorno que nos rodea. No está peleada una cosa con la otra.
Mike, can I just add something to Francisco's excellent points? I agree with Javier. Our experience at Palantir has been that the same tools can be used for bottom-up, top-down, and what I'll call inside-out. So certainly in terms of finding networks and developing networks, you know, Marines figuring out IED networks in Afghanistan. The exact same tool with different data and different uses. Top-down, looking at where is US aid going? How is that aid comparing to where they're seeing IED attacks? And from a top-down perspective, trying to figure out what sorts of programs might reduce the risk of the IEDs in the first place. Third, the inside-out is the same tools that are being used there. This might make some people uncomfortable, but I think it's really critical from a privacy and civil liberties perspective, using the tool to go back and see who's looking at what. So you're actually looking at your own organization and saying, who is accessing this data? Why are they accessing this data? And is this a proper use for that data? So I think well-designed technology can tackle all of these pieces. And again, it depends on what the questions you're asking, not what the technology is.
Well, you know, that raises another issue. People talk about using data analytics not only to establish relationships or audit trails, but actually to predict that certain kinds of behavior suggest someone is about to engage in a terrorist act or an act of violence. Let me ask each of the panelists whether you've had the experience of dealing with predictive analytics, and have you found it useful, or is it perhaps more promise than performance? I'll start with you, Francisco.
Sorry, I didn't catch the complete.
The question was about predictive analytics, using data not only to establish relations among things that have happened historically or occurring currently, but to actually look at associations between behavior and illegal conduct to say this kind of behavior is suggestive of illegal conduct, and therefore it's something we ought to use to predict where we ought to focus attention. Have you had the experience of being able to use that, each of you? Yeah.
Sí, en este caso y con la cantidad de información que hoy tenemos más de 500 millones de registros en base de datos, sistemas dedicados al análisis, sobre todo en el ámbito de inteligencia, y desde luego esto nos va arrojando datos en el terreno, usando también mucha cartografía, mapas de Google específicamente. Hemos logrado ir entendiendo el fenómeno delictivo y cómo se va moviendo en el tiempo y en la geografía, y dónde tenemos que poner nuestros elementos policiales, con qué perfil deberán estar, con qué equipamiento deberán estar, en qué lugares, para tratar de ir, pues no digo adivinando, pero proyectando hacia dónde se va a ir moviendo los grupos criminales, ¿no? Entendiendo que en el ámbito federal, que es lo que nos toca a nosotros, vemos desde luego los crímenes que tienen que ver con el ámbito federal. México, y quisiera aclararlo, México, si se considera hoy inseguro, es por temas de robo, no por tema de violencia ni por tema de secuestro, que son los temas que cuando pregunta uno a la gente, ¿por qué cree que es inseguro México? Pues mucha gente dice, se están matando, ¿no? Es que es cosa más falsa, no la hay. Realmente la percepción que se ha desarrollado en el público es totalmente opuesta a la realidad que estamos viviendo en México. El gran problema de México se llama robo. Ese es el tema que tenemos que cuidar todos los elementos que estamos en la parte policial, y desde luego la parte de secuestro y violencia, que va como parte del ataque que hemos generado hacia los grupos de cárteles de droga como resultado de eso. Es un elemento importante, pero no es todo lo que está pasando en el país. Entonces, bueno, al final de cuentas tenemos información para empezar a hacer predicción de cómo se van a mover ciertos cárteles, los grupos de secuestro que tenemos perfectamente identificados. Les doy una cifra, tenemos 17,000 casos de investigación abiertos, y esto nos permite mapear perfectamente quiénes son los jugadores que están involucrados, cómo se mueven, con quién se mueven, y desde luego la cooperación internacional con agencias como de Estados Unidos o de Interpol también. Hemos logrado tener una visión más completa del comportamiento criminal en México. Sí estamos moviéndonos en los temas de proyección, finalmente.
Mike, did you find predictive analytics useful in NCTC?
You have to start with the terms. Predictive analytics, cloud, big data, it just depends on who asks and what they mean. As a general matter, I have found both in my prior work as a drug prosecutor, counterterrorism, and now in other sectors, predictive analytics, and what we mean by that is a machine telling you where the next problem is best when your adversary is stupid. The smarter the adversary you have, the less good any technology is going to be at telling you what's next.
Isn't that true of all law enforcement, though? I mean, stupid criminals get caught and smart ones tend not to be
Absolutely.
caught.
So if you look at the basic credit card fraud problem, everyone here has probably had their credit card turned off at some point because they have a charge on their card which is outside an algorithmic calculation that is normal for you or me or whatever it is. That's great. How well does that algorithm in terms of predictive analytics do against a sophisticated synthetic credit card fraud ring? It's not going to catch it at all. PayPal saw this. Basic algorithms caught 80% of their fraud. The problem was the 20% it didn't catch was 80% of the loss. So the sophisticated adversary makes it harder. And I agree that what we can do is use data to help show us what has happened historically, help model what may happen in the future, redirect resources, and then you use the best predictive analytic tool that we still have in this world, which is the human brain, to dig into that analysis and make predictions about where things might occur, test hypotheses. And you can be predictive in that, but I'm still resistant to the idea that there is either a find fraudster, find mafia, or find terrorist button in any algorithm anyone has yet made.
Javier, what's your experience been with using predictive analytics as a, not only as a broad tool, but also as a specific tool?
Yeah, well, mine is a story out of frustration, I would say. I was studying my PhD in political science at Notre Dame, wanted to study the drug violence in Mexico, and there was no data, no publicly available data. So I decided, well, let's create some data. So I started using automated coding protocols to basically adapt a software that has the computer reading in Spanish and take the textual information, put it into a database, and generate a lot of data. This is about like 10 million observations at municipal level on a daily basis on different types of drug violence. Who did what to whom, when, and where. That's the basic model of the database that I have. In the meantime, the government opens up some data, but it's like very poor quality data. It's aggregated in a quarterly basis at municipal level, and they stopped updating the data. So you cannot get really good, precise estimations out of this. So with the information that I have, I've been able to disentangle different types of violence, different directions of violence. Violence conducted from the state against drug cartels, how those criminal organizations fight back, and also how they fight each other. And with this very fine-grained information at municipal level on a daily basis on who did what to whom, then I've been trying to use some forecasting techniques broadly used in the financial markets. I use impulse response functions, which basically is like kind of a statistical model to say, what will happen if you move this thing? What will be the reaction of these other things? And based on that, I've been able to find like very nice defined behavioral patterns of how the government is disrupting criminal organizations, how they attack back, and how that creates violence among rival criminal organizations. But I must say that one of the most important things about forecasting is that we have to be responsible for what we say, and we have to be transparent as academics. We have to put our data out there so anyone can replicate, find errors, or corroborate some results. And one of the most important things is to report the margin of error. I mean, it's not that it will increase or decrease. Well, that's a very basic discussion. How much will that increase? How certain are you about that increase? Is it up 5%, 10%, or is it range from 15 to 25, or a very wide range? So I think one of the biggest challenges of using forecasting is to use this data paired with very powerful analytical tools, but also like the human brain and the responsibility and ethical backgrounds that we will have to put into that.
Can I take Javier's point one step farther? Because you come up with a perfect system for predictive analytics for the National Counterterrorism Center. And that relatively perfect system, all right, let's imagine that it goes at 95% certainty. A 5% error rate in a watch list system, which has 1.2 million people in it, you have serious problems. Yeah. So you have to accept the error rate, which again helps guide the people as to where they should look and how they should look at the data. But we shouldn't look at technology at this point to make some of these really hard decisions, because there are enormous civil liberties consequences and privacy consequences, the error rate that we would face.
Yeah, totally agree.
So, I mean, I think the consensus view I see here is that while these are incredibly useful tools to leverage and multiply the analytic powers of human beings, they are not a substitute for human judgment and human analysis.
Yes.
Well, it's been a really great panel. I do think it's fair to say that this terrific tool, big data, is going to be around. It's going to expand. The amount of collection is going to continue to increase. We'll continue to be challenged in how we digest it, make it usable, and make it valuable to decision makers. But a lot of it depends on asking the right question. Any final comments from any of the panelists?
Me gustaría mencionar tan solo de todo lo que he escuchado en estos paneles. Yo mencionaría que lo bueno, si queremos hablar de lo bueno, es el gran avance que hemos tenido en la tecnología y servicios, y esto lo ha experimentado pues todo el mundo. Lo malo, la gran distancia que hay entre las nuevas... Tomo el micrófono porque creo que no me escuchan por allá. Repito, lo bueno es el gran avance en tecnología y servicios que ha experimentado el mundo. Lo malo, la gran distancia que hemos visto que existe entre las nuevas tecnologías, servicios y la normatividad para su utilización y explotación. Lo bueno es que servicios como el Internet, la web, pueden ser útiles para cualquier persona. Lo malo es que los criminales también aprovechan las bondades de la tecnología para actuar en contra de la sociedad. Lo malo es que con los conceptos de la globalización y el Internet, los criminales pueden comunicarse y trabajar de manera amplia y organizada. Lo bueno es que cada día hay más conciencia en el uso de la tecnología y que eventos como en el que hoy estamos, gracias a Google, nos permite trabajar en equipo para el bien común. Gracias.
Well, thank you to Google Ideas for hosting this in the Council on Foreign Relations and Tribeca. I think you couldn't end with a better note. There's both a good and a bad in all of this, and we've got to try to focus on fostering the good part. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike.
My
Thank you very
pleasure.
much.
Thank you.